It happened in the middle of a perfectly normal afternoon. I was sipping iced tea on the patio of a resort I helped finance, pretending to scroll through my phone, when she walked in, hips swaying, hair too perfect, smile too smug. She paused just inside the threshold like she was waiting for applause. My stomach twisted, not from jealousy, but from certainty. I recognized her from photos I wasn't supposed to see. That was the woman my husband had been secretly spending weekends with. I knew her name, the brand of perfume she wore, even the birthmark on her left collarbone. I had known for 6 months. What I didn't know, what no one expected, was what she was about to announce to a room full of investors, executives, and the press. I kept my expression neutral as she sashayed up to the microphone, clipboard in hand, like she belonged there. I could feel eyes darting toward her, then to me, then quickly away. The hush in the room was sharp enough to draw blood. I glanced over at David, my husband, the CEO in title only, and watched the color drain from his face. Good. He hadn't expected her here. He definitely hadn't expected this. She tapped the microphone twice. "Thank you all for coming," she said sweetly, her voice wrapped in silk and poison. "I know this isn't part of the scheduled program, but I have an important announcement to make on behalf of David Cole." My name was still legally Isabella Cole, and even hearing her say his name like that made my teeth clench. But I didn't interrupt. I let her continue. "I'm proud to share that David and I are expecting our first child." Gasps rippled through the room like a dropped stone in still water. I watched a few people turn toward me, faces pinched with horror or fascination. I could never tell which. The mistress, Melanie, held her belly, which had a barely there bump, as though she were some sort of royal figure gracing us with a gift of life. "We're thrilled," she added, eyes sweeping the crowd before resting boldly on me. "And we look forward to raising our child together, building a future with love and purpose." It was almost admirable, really, the way she delivered betrayal like it was a bouquet of roses. David was frozen. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like a fish desperate for oxygen. He looked at me finally, and for a moment, I saw something close to panic in his eyes. He hadn't planned this. Melanie had just taken control of the narrative, and possibly his life. But what neither of them seemed to understand, even now, even as Melanie smugly stepped away from the microphone to a flurry of shocked whispers, was that I held the real power. I rose slowly, not rushing, not making a scene. I wanted every eye on me when I spoke. My heels clicked across the marble floor with confidence, born not from pride, but from truth. I reached the podium, gently adjusted the microphone, and smiled. "Thank you, Melanie," I said, with more warmth than she deserved. "And congratulations. Truly." She blinked, uncertain now, unsure where I was going with this. David stood behind her like a ghost at his own funeral. "You know," I continued, glancing at the audience, "some of you know me as David's wife. Some of you know me as his co-founder. But what many of you don't know is that 15 years ago, before David ever pitched his first client, I was the one who registered this company's name. I was the one who filed the paperwork, found the office space, and used my inheritance to fund the first 2 years of operations." The room stilled again, dead silent. "I've been the majority shareholder for over a decade," I said, letting the weight of it settle over the crowd. "David has always been the face. The charming, polished, likable face. But legally, this company is mine." I turned then, slowly, locking eyes with the two of them. "Which means this little's announcement," I gestured delicately, "doesn't change anything. Melanie, I wish you a safe and healthy pregnancy. But let's not pretend you've secured anything more than a child support check." Someone actually gasped. David moved then, just a twitch, really, but I turned to him fully, letting all my years of silence sharpen into words. "And you, David. We had an agreement. A deal. You got to play CEO while I ran things behind the scenes. You got the spotlight. I kept the control. But that deal is over now. Melanie stepped forward. You can do this. Oh, I already have, I said, holding up the legal packet my assistant had slid into my purse earlier that day. This is a termination notice. Effective immediately, David is no longer CEO. The board has been notified. HR is processing the separation package. You'll receive a couriered copy by morning. David's mouth moved again, but no sound came. Melanie looked like she'd swallowed her own tongue. And one more thing, I added, stepping down. We're changing the locks. I didn't need to say more. I walked away as calmly as I had stood, my phone buzzing with messages I wouldn't read until tomorrow. Outside, the sun was still shining, the air still sweet with orange blossoms. I'd just upended my marriage, reasserted control over my company, and humiliated my husband's mistress in front of the entire industry, and I felt nothing but calm. But that was only the beginning. Looking back, it's strange how quickly a marriage can become a performance. From the outside, David and I looked ideal. Polished smiles at galas, effortless charm at charity events, two halves of a power couple everyone envied. But behind those closed doors, our dynamic was more about roles than romance. I played the composed, competent businesswoman who didn't mind being in the shadows, and he played the magnetic visionary people couldn't help but trust. It worked. Until it didn't. I met David when I was 25. I had just inherited a sizable trust from my grandmother, who always believed I'd do something important, and I was teetering between pursuing my MBA or diving headfirst into something more ambitious. David was a smooth talker with messy curls and a dream, a tech startup that would revolutionize small business logistics. He had the spark, the charm, and enough enthusiasm to light up a city. What he didn't have was money, a business license, or the faintest idea how to make a budget. But I believed in him. More than that, I believed in us. It felt like we were building something that was truly ours from scratch. We brainstormed at 2 a.m, shared ramen while coding in our pajamas, and rented a tiny apartment over a laundromat where the dryer shook the whole floor. For years, we lived and breathed that company. I handled the paperwork, the investor meetings, the staffing logistics. He handled the pitch decks, the public face. It wasn't always easy, but we were a team, and I thought that mattered. Somewhere along the way, it stopped mattering. At first, it was subtle. David started staying later at the office, brushing off our weekly dinners with vague excuses. He grew more image-conscious, hiring a stylist, obsessing over social media, always posing. I chalked it up to stress, to ambition. We were expanding rapidly, and he felt the pressure of being the guy everyone looked to. I didn't resent him for that. Not at first. But then came the lies. Little ones, at first. Receipts that didn't match his stories, meetings that didn't exist, a whiff of perfume on a shirt he swore he hadn't worn that week. I didn't confront him immediately. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid, that I trusted him. I wish I'd trusted myself more. It was my assistant, Naomi, who finally confirmed it. She had stayed late to prep for a board meeting and accidentally walked in on David in his office, with a woman she described as definitely not you. Naomi apologized for days, thinking she'd ruined something. But I only thanked her, because finally I had proof. Real, gut-wrenching, soul-shattering proof. Her name was Melanie Russo, 29, ambitious, recently hired as a PR consultant. I did my research. She had a history of working closely with male executives. She was good at appearing indispensable, and even better at making herself irreplaceable to the men who fell for her act. I could have fired her on the spot. Legally, I had every right. But instead, I watched. I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to see how David looked at her. And most of all, I needed to figure out why I didn't feel anger, just a dull, aching disappointment that clung to my ribs like frost. Melanie, for all her flaws, was not stupid. She quickly picked up on the shift. She played it cool around me, always deferential, overly polite, as if she could charm her way out of what I already knew. But I wasn't looking for an apology. I was watching a slow-motion car crash, waiting for the right moment to pull the brakes, and knowing that when I did, the wreckage would be spectacular. What complicated everything was that David wasn't cruel. He wasn't some monster cheating for the thrill. He was weak, needy, addicted to praise. He craved admiration like oxygen, and Melanie gave it to him with wide eyes and breathy laughs. I used to give him that kind of attention too. Before the board meetings, the tax audits, the midnight calls from overseas partners. Before the real weight of success made me too tired to play cheerleader. He wasn't malicious, but he was selfish. And sometimes that's worse. Meanwhile, I buried myself in work. I took over more of the day-to-day operations, started quietly revising contracts, adjusting shares, and isolating David's authority. He never noticed. He was too busy basking in the illusion of control, too wrapped up in the fantasy that Melanie would make everything feel new again. But I was always 5 steps ahead, quietly rerouting the future he thought he was designing without me. And all the while I smiled. I smiled at board meetings. I smiled at family dinners. I smiled through our 10th anniversary, even when he skipped the dinner I planned because Melanie had a crisis. I smiled through it all, and I waited. Not for revenge, but for clarity. For the moment when I could step into the storm and not just survive it, but own it. What I didn't expect was that Melanie would move so quickly. She knew David was her ticket to a better life, and she wasn't going to waste time playing coy. Within 3 months of their affair becoming physical, she was spending nights at his condo. Within 6, she had weaseled her way into company meetings, always under the guise of consulting. And within 9, she was pregnant. At first, I thought it was a ploy, a manipulation tactic, something to trap him or secure her position. But the sonogram photos she left accidentally in the break room, the morning sickness she dramatically faked in front of the staff, it became clear this wasn't a drill. She really thought she was going to be the next Mrs. Cole. That's when I stopped watching and started acting. I spent sleepless nights reviewing contracts, updating shareholder agreements, and aligning the board behind me. Quietly, strategically, I moved every piece into place. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused, purposeful. A woman scorned doesn't burn the house down. She buys the land beneath it. David still had no idea. Melanie, for all her cunning, underestimated me. She thought I was a passive, out-of-touch wife, but she didn't understand who she was dealing with. She never bothered to look at the fine print, the contracts, the silent partnerships, the legal protections I'd put in place when we were still nothing but a 2-person dream in a basement office. She didn't know the kind of woman I was because she only ever saw the mask I let her see. I suppose that's the fatal flaw in underestimating someone who smiles too much. You never know what they're hiding behind it. As the day of the investor summit approached, I finalized my plan. David was going to announce a new global expansion strategy. Melanie was going to prance around like the queen of the castle, and I was going to remind everyone who the real architect of this empire was. I didn't need revenge. I just needed recognition. And when Melanie took that microphone in front of 300 industry leaders, journalists, and stakeholders, declaring her pregnancy and their future with such smug certainty, she handed me the perfect setup. Because what better time to reclaim a throne than when your enemies think they've won? But here's the truth. Beneath all the strategy, the power plays, and the legal maneuvering, I was still a woman whose heart had been broken. I had loved David. I had given him everything. And in return, he chose someone younger, louder, and easier. He chose novelty over loyalty. I wasn't angry that he left me emotionally. I was angry that he thought I'd wait for him to come back. Melanie thought this baby would secure her place. David thought charm would excuse betrayal. But I had learned long ago that hope was a fragile thing, and power, real power, came not from how loud you spoke, but from how firmly you held the pen when you signed the checks. That summit was supposed to be the beginning of their reign. Instead, it was the end of an illusion. And the beginning of mine. The fallout was instant and ruthless. By the time I got to my car that evening, my phone had exploded with messages. Journalists were already circling, speculating about the abrupt leadership change, the scandalous reveal, and the so-called takeover by the wife no one had seen coming. The headlines were merciless. CEO ousted by wife after Mistress's pregnancy bombshell, power couple implodes at summit. The real boss behind the throne steps into the spotlight. It was everywhere. My carefully guarded anonymity had shattered in an instant, replaced with a new identity, the woman who took everything back. I sat in my parked car for a long time that night, the interior silent except for the occasional ping from my phone. My fingers trembled slightly, not from regret, but from the sheer adrenaline of it all. I hadn't fully processed what I'd done until that moment. For 15 years, I had let David be the face, the voice, the star. Now I had pulled off the mask for both of us and exposed the messy truth beneath the polish. And the world loved it. Most of it anyway. The press painted me as a mixture of villain and hero. Some called me cold, calculating, ruthless. Others hailed me as a feminist icon. A few right-wing blogs accused me of destroying a man's legacy out of emotional hysteria, which made me laugh out loud in the middle of my kitchen while making tea. Apparently, reclaiming what was legally mine made me unhinged. David, on the other hand, disappeared. For the first 72 hours, he made no public comment. His lawyer contacted mine, asking to negotiate a graceful transition. I declined. Grace was never offered to me, and I wasn't going to manufacture it for the sake of optics. Internally, he was still clinging to whatever pride he had left, hoping to spin this as a temporary restructuring or a mutual decision. But the public had already moved on. They weren't interested in his carefully worded statements. They were invested in my story. And Melanie? She doubled down. 2 days after the summit, she posted a glossy photo on Instagram of her holding her baby bump, captioned, *, in times of chaos, protect your peace. Our child is a blessing, not a scandal. #new beginnings. It was so tone-deaf, I almost felt embarrassed for her. Almost. But beneath the noise, there was a strange quiet inside me. I thought I'd feel victorious. I thought I'd be lighter. Instead, there was a heaviness I hadn't expected, like I'd stepped out of a storm only to realize I had no idea what the sun felt like anymore. Because the truth was, I hadn't just taken back a company. I had lost a marriage. And while that marriage had been unraveling for years, I'd still carried it, quietly, stubbornly, like an heirloom I refused to part with, even when it stopped serving a purpose. Now it was gone, and I was free. But freedom is its own kind of lonely. I tried to stay focused. I threw myself into work. I met with department heads, sat through strategy sessions, restructured the PR team. Internally, morale soared. I was a symbol of strength, resilience, a leader who had taken control under fire. But at home, the silence was deafening. There were moments, late at night, brushing my teeth, or passing by the empty side of the bed, when grief would ambush me. Not grief for David himself, but for the version of us I had once believed in. The girl who used to dream beside him, the woman who built an empire in his shadow, the wife who thought love meant sacrifice. That version of me was gone now too. But there were moments of light too. Small, unexpected ones. Like the email I got from an old college professor, simply saying, *, you always were the sharpest in the room. Proud of you. *, or the woman in the elevator at corporate headquarters who whispered, thank you for showing them how it's done. Or Naomi, my assistant, who brought me lemon scones one morning and said, I hope one day I'm half as fearless as you. Those were the pieces I held on to. Meanwhile, David finally surfaced. He requested a private meeting, no lawyers, no press, just the two of us. I agreed. I was curious to see the man I had once shared my life with stripped of all the glitter and lies. When he walked into my office, he looked older than I remembered. Tired. Like someone who'd just realized the house he built was on borrowed land. Bella, he said softly, using the nickname he hadn't uttered in over a year. I'm sorry. I didn't speak. I wanted him to feel the silence the way I had for so long. I never meant for things to get so out of hand, he continued. I was lost. I felt invisible. You were always 2 steps ahead of me, and I just wanted to feel seen. Important. It was the most honest thing he'd said in years. And somehow it made me sadder. You were seen, David, I finally said. You just stopped looking back. He bowed his head. I know I ruined everything. I studied him for a moment, the man I had once loved. There was no rage left, just a kind of quiet mourning. You didn't ruin everything, I said gently. You just reminded me it was mine all along. He nodded. And then he did something I never expected. He stood, extended his hand, and said, Congratulations. You did what I never could. We shook hands like business partners closing a chapter. It was strange, civil, almost kind. And I knew then that this was the ending we were always heading toward. Not with fire and fury, but with a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost and what had been found. The media circus eventually moved on. A new scandal took the headlines, a different celebrity imploded, and the world spun forward. Melanie faded back into irrelevance, still clinging to the idea that being a mother would keep her in David's orbit. I suspected he would do his part financially, but the magic had gone. Their fairy tale had rotted from the inside. And me? I found peace, not in power, but in truth. I started mentoring young women founders. I took a vacation alone for the first time in my life and read 5 novels on a beach in Bali. I went dancing in Rome with strangers who didn't know my name. I laughed more in 3 months than I had in the last 3 years. And one morning, standing barefoot on a balcony with the sunrise spilling across my face, I finally understood something. The power I had reclaimed wasn't just over a company. It was over myself. And no one, not David, not Melanie, not anyone, could take that away from me again. The turning point didn't come in some dramatic, stormy confrontation. It came in the form of stillness. Quiet, slow, and profound. I was sitting in my home office one evening, thumbing through old planning notebooks from the early days of the company. Each page was filled with hastily drawn schematics, scribbled notes in the margins, and signatures from both me and David, proof of how we used to dream together. I found one entry dated almost 15 years ago. It said, asterisk, let's build something the world remembers, and never forget each other in the process. Asterisk. It was in my handwriting. I stared at that line for a long time, and then it hit me. I had kept my promise. He hadn't. I had built something the world would remember. And now it was time to decide what kind of legacy I wanted to leave. Not just for the company or the press or the people who whispered my name like it carried legend, but for myself. For the woman who had spent too long shrinking to make others comfortable. That was the night I made my decision. I wasn't going to simply lead the company. I was going to transform it. The next day, I called a closed-door meeting with the executive team and board members. These were the people who had quietly supported me through the transition, the ones who'd watched me move from the background to the helm. They expected stability, a cautious continuation of what had already been built. Instead, I pitched reinvention. I laid out a 5-year roadmap that would pivot our business towards sustainable logistics, merging AI with green infrastructure. I proposed investing heavily in minority and women-owned tech suppliers. I announced we'd be launching a philanthropic wing of the company, something I'd dreamed about for years but was always told wasn't the right time. And then I did something no one saw coming. I offered David a ceremonial consulting role. No power, no shares, no salary. Just a title. A symbolic gesture that would allow the company to save face publicly and give him space to exit quietly. The board was stunned. Some whispered that I was being too generous. But it wasn't about generosity. It was about control, narrative, closure. David, to his credit, accepted the role with quiet gratitude. He knew the game was over. He would never again be the face of this company. But he wasn't cruel enough to sabotage what we'd once built together, not now. Maybe he finally understood what I had protected all those years. Melanie, however, didn't take it so well. A week later, I received a sharply worded letter from her lawyer claiming she had been integral to the company's public relations and branding strategy and therefore deserved compensation. She requested a severance package. She even hinted at legal action, citing emotional distress caused by a hostile workplace. I didn't even flinch. I had my legal team issue a polite but firm response, detailing every instance of conflict of interest, inappropriate conduct, and breach of policy. Melanie's position had never been official. She was a consultant, contractual, temporary, and ultimately dispensable. Still, she persisted. She made one final move, posting a video online. A tearful confession riddled with vague accusations about how she was ostracized by powerful women and silenced for loving the wrong man. It went semi-viral for 48 hours, just enough to stir curiosity, but not enough to stick. Most people had already moved on. They didn't see her as a victim. They saw her as what she was, a side note in someone else's story. And as her attempts fizzled out, mine surged forward. The new initiatives gained traction almost immediately. Investors were enthusiastic. The public loved the idea of a woman-led tech company boldly pivoting towards social responsibility. We secured new partnerships, expanded into 3 new countries, and made headlines not for scandal, but for impact. But it wasn't all smooth. One late night, I stood alone in the new warehouse prototype site in Austin. It was quiet, unfinished, the skeleton of a vision that only existed in drawings and schematics. My heels echoed off the concrete as I walked, and I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me, not just the responsibility, but the choice I had made to carry it. I could have walked away. After the summit, I had every opportunity to sell my shares, vanish from public life, and start over somewhere no one knew me. But I hadn't. I chose this. I chose to stay, to rebuild, to lead. And with that choice came sacrifice. There were relationships that didn't survive. Some friends were too aligned with David to stay neutral. Others felt intimidated by the spotlight I now occupied. Dating was laughable. Most men either wanted a trophy or felt threatened. But I didn't mind. Not yet. I had more important things to do than entertain fragile egos. Still, there were nights the loneliness crept in, like smoke curling under a door you forgot to close. It was during one of those evenings that I got an unexpected message. A woman named Carla, one of our warehouse shift managers, had emailed me personally. She wrote, "I just wanted to say thank you. My daughter saw you in Forbes last week and said, 'Mom, she looks like you.' She's never said that about anyone important before. So thank you for showing her it's possible." I read that email 3 times. Then I cried. Not because I was sad, but because I wasn't. Because something inside me had finally realigned. My purpose wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine. It was about reshaping what was next. Meanwhile, David had begun to change too. We met a few times over the next few months, mostly business, sometimes casual. He looked healthier somehow. Softer around the edges. One afternoon over coffee he said, "You were always going to win. I just didn't realize the game we were playing." I didn't respond. I just stirred my drink, letting the silence stretch between us. Then he added, "You didn't have to offer me that title. I know you did it so I could leave with some dignity. I don't deserve it. But thank you." It was the closest he ever came to an apology. And maybe in his way it was one. Melanie, by that point, had moved to another city. I heard whispers that she was trying to start her own consultancy firm, leaning heavily on the attention she got during the scandal. But her relevance had fizzled. Without David, she didn't have the platform. Without the company, she didn't have the backing. And without me, she didn't have an enemy to fuel her narrative. Eventually, she stopped reaching out. Stopped trying to claw her way back into something that had already moved on. And I began to breathe again. I hosted a company-wide retreat that summer in the mountains, bringing together all departments for the first time. We hiked. We brainstormed. We built fires and shared stories. And one night, under a blanket of stars, one of our interns asked me, "What's the biggest lesson you've learned this year?" I smiled, thought for a moment, then said, "Never confuse love with loyalty. One you give freely, the other you earn every single day." There was silence after that. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. That was the moment I knew we were finally turning a corner. That the pain, the betrayal, the scandal, it had all been a prelude to something better. Something lasting. I had transformed not just my life, but the lives of the people I led. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted freedom. I wanted truth. And in choosing that, I became the woman I had always been beneath the compromises. A builder, a leader, a survivor, and more than anything, myself. The high-stakes moment arrived 6 months later, disguised as an opportunity. Our company had been nominated for a Global Innovation Award, one of the most prestigious in our industry. It was a celebration of not only the business pivots we'd made, but the cultural transformation that had taken place under my leadership. Out of hundreds of companies, we were one of the 5 finalists. The ceremony was to be held in Geneva, attended by global investors, media titans, and leaders from every continent. It would be broadcast live, and I was slated to speak on behalf of the company if we won. It was an honor, but it also triggered something unexpected. As I stood in front of the mirror the morning of the flight, dressed in a crisp navy suit, I caught my own reflection, and I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not because I had changed physically, but because I had grown into a presence that no longer shrank in shame or sadness. My posture, my gaze, even the quiet way I breathed, it all radiated something new. Power. Peace. And yet, underneath it, a current of nerves pulsed. Not because I feared failure, but because I feared what winning would finally mean. There would be no turning back. No anonymity. No room left to hide behind shared credit or diluted legacy. If we won, the company would no longer be co-founded or previously led by, it would be mine. Fully. Publicly. That night in Geneva, under the golden lights of the Grand Hall, they announced our name. We won. Applause erupted. Flashbulbs flickered. I rose to my feet as our team cheered, faces glowing with pride. As I walked toward the stage, every step felt heavier than the last, until I reached the podium, looked out over the sea of faces, and suddenly, it all lifted. I took a breath and began. "This award isn't about victory," I said, voice steady. "It's about reclaiming stories that were silenced. It's about rebuilding something that was broken, not just in infrastructure or strategy, but in trust, in values, in leadership." I glanced down at the paper I'd prepared and folded it shut. "I want to tell you a truth," I continued. 6 months ago, I stood in the ashes of betrayal. I was the wife who was left, the partner who was dismissed, the founder who was hidden. I had every reason to leave, but I didn't. I stayed. And I didn't stay to prove anything to the man who wronged me or to the world that doubted me. I stayed because I realized that the only thing more powerful than heartbreak is purpose. Silence swept across the room. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle. You don't rebuild an empire for revenge. You rebuild it to remind yourself you're still the architect. The audience rose. Standing ovation. Backstage, I cried. quietly, joyfully. I wasn't just proud, I was whole. And the final threads of the story began to weave themselves together after that. David sent me a message the day after the award ceremony. It was a voice note just under a minute. I watched your speech. I don't think I've ever truly seen you until now. I'm sorry for that. I hope, wherever this journey takes you next, you never forget who you are. And if you ever need anything, just ask. It was simple. No grand gestures. No requests for forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. And it was enough. Melanie, on the other hand, had gone radio silent. I later heard she'd left the consultancy world entirely and moved back to her hometown. She had the baby, named her Grace. I felt no bitterness toward that child. She was innocent in it all. In fact, part of me even hoped Melanie had learned something real from all this, that starting over required more than status. It required humility. One unexpected day, I bumped into someone I hadn't seen in years, Lena, one of my closest friends from grad school. She'd fallen out of touch during the height of David's press era, swept up in the same current of people who thought success was measured by proximity to him. But here she was, standing in front of me in a bookstore, holding a copy of my newly published memoir. I read it, she said softly, cover to cover. I cried. I laughed. And I realized I'd been a coward all those years. I looked at her, surprised. You don't owe me anything. I do, she insisted. But more importantly, I owe myself better friends. If you're open to it, I'd like to start again. We got coffee, then dinner. Then slowly, a friendship rekindled. Not from nostalgia, but from a shared hunger to be better women than we had been in our 20s. The company flourished. Not just in revenue, but in spirit. We had restructured into a cooperative leadership model, promoting talent from within. We offered scholarships to girls in underserved communities. We developed mentorship programs for women re-entering the workforce after maternity. Every decision was rooted in the values I had once been told were soft. Now, they were our greatest strength. And for the first time in a very long time, I started to think about my next chapter. Not just professionally, but personally. I began painting again. Something I hadn't done since college. I started volunteering once a week at a community center, helping young women write resumes and college applications. I even adopted a dog, an aging golden retriever named Max, with cloudy eyes and a tail that never stopped wagging. And then one quiet Sunday morning, I met someone. He was a literary editor who'd been assigned to help me polish the final draft of my memoir. At first, I kept him at arm's length. Polite, professional, detached. But he saw through it. Not in a manipulative way. Just gently, patiently. I'm not here to fix you, he once said, over dinner in a tiny hole-in-the-wall Indian place. I'm just here to witness who you become next. I didn't say anything in that moment. But later that night, as I curled up with Max on the couch, I let myself smile. Because I was ready to be seen again, not for what I had survived, but for what I was becoming. Years passed. The scandal faded, replaced by new dramas, new headlines. But what remained was the foundation I'd rebuilt, with my own hands, my own heart. And every so often, someone would approach me on the street, in an elevator, at a conference, and say, "You're the woman from that story, right?" And I'd nod, but I'd always say the same thing. No. That was just the beginning. Because the real story wasn't the scandal. It was the strength that rose from it. It was the grace of walking away from a man who broke me and building something sacred from the shards. It was finding my voice, reclaiming my name, and knowing, without a doubt, that I had never needed to be given power. I had been powerful all along. Looking back, I realize now that my story was never really about betrayal. It was about becoming. When you love someone, especially deeply, you imagine your futures as threads woven into the same fabric. You build dreams on shared ground, assuming the soil beneath you is strong and true. But sometimes that ground breaks. And when it does, you're left standing in a storm you never saw coming. I didn't just lose a husband. I lost illusions. I lost the version of myself who thought playing small was safer, who thought loyalty had to come at the cost of her own voice, her own name. But in that unraveling, something beautiful happened. I began to uncover a woman I had buried for far too long. The strategist, the builder, the visionary who no longer needed to hide behind someone else's spotlight. That is the quiet miracle of pain. It introduces you to your real self. This story, in all its heartbreak and humiliation, taught me that power isn't taken or granted. It's owned, not because someone signs over a title or a check or a company, but because you choose to stand up when everything around you says sit down. Because you choose to speak truth even when it shakes. Because you look in the mirror, see the damage, and still say, I am worth rebuilding. To anyone listening who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, or betrayed, this is what I want you to take away. You are not the broken pieces someone left behind. You are the architect of what comes next. You don't need to become hard to survive heartbreak. You don't need to become bitter to learn boundaries. And you certainly don't need to stay silent to keep the peace. Sometimes peace must be disrupted to make room for something deeper, something real. I found peace in owning my story. I found joy in reclaiming what I built. And I found freedom not in revenge, but in restoration. What David and Melanie tried to take from me was never truly theirs. Because what they didn't understand was that I was the foundation. I was the blueprint. I was the soul behind every system, every hire, every late-night strategy session that turned ideas into empires. And no affair, no scandal, no whispered rumor could erase that truth. The real victory wasn't the award in Geneva. It wasn't the viral speeches or best-selling memoir. It was this: waking up every morning knowing I no longer had to prove anything to anyone. The weight of that is freedom. The beauty of it is quiet. There is a sunrise I think about often. It happened on the day I returned from Geneva. I stood on my balcony, coffee in hand, the sky stretching open like a fresh page. The sun rose slowly, confidently, casting soft gold across the city below. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel rushed. I didn't feel panicked. I just stood there and watched. Because I knew, without question, that I had already done the hardest part. I had faced the truth. I had stayed in the fire long enough to forge something stronger. And I had walked out not burned, not bitter, but whole. So, if you're standing in the ashes right now, hear me when I say this. The fire didn't come to destroy you. It came to reveal who you are when everything else is stripped away. And you are powerful. You are sacred. You are the one they never saw coming. Let them look now. Let them see what you've become.